When Adolf Hitler came to power in January 1933, Germany was a nation exhausted by humiliation. The wounds of the First World War still bled through its streets: hunger, unemployment, and rage. The people wanted order. Hitler promised it. What they received was obedience, enforced not by law but by fear. From the very first days of the Nazi regime, the idea of a secret police was central to its survival. The new state did not only need soldiers or politicians, it needed watchers, men who could see into every home and silence every whisper. Within months of Hitler's rise, Hermann Göring, one of his most loyal followers, created the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police. The world would come to know it by a single word: Gestapo. The Gestapo was born in Prussia in April 1933. It was small at first, just a few hundred officers taken from the regular police. But it had a new purpose. It answered not to the law, but to the Führer. Its job was simple and horrifying: to find enemies of the state and to make sure they disappeared. Their first targets were obvious: communists, trade unionists, and political opponents. Thousands were arrested within weeks, often on anonymous denunciations. The prisons filled quickly, so the Nazis built new ones: concentration camps, hidden behind barbed wire and euphemistic names. The first was Dachau. It would not be the last. But the Gestapo's real power did not come from numbers. It came from its invisibility. They wore no uniforms, carried no insignia. They could be anyone: a neighbor, a teacher, a friend. The people never knew who belonged to the Gestapo and who merely feared them enough to act like they did. By 1934, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, took control of the Gestapo and turned it into the backbone of Nazi terror. Under his rule, the organization expanded into every corner of Germany. It merged with the SS intelligence service, creating a vast machine of surveillance. Files were opened on millions of citizens, phones were tapped, letters read, whispers noted. But the most chilling part was how unnecessary most of it became. The Gestapo didn't need to spy on everyone. The people began to spy on themselves. Propaganda and fear had done their work. Neighbors denounced neighbors for jokes about Hitler. Children reported parents for careless words. Husbands turned in wives. It wasn't just the Gestapo that watched Germany. It was Germany that watched itself. The Gestapo thrived on this culture of betrayal. Its offices received over 100,000 denunciations every year. Most came not from professional agents, but from ordinary citizens trying to protect themselves, settle grudges, or prove loyalty. Each report could mean arrest, interrogation, or death. In public, the Gestapo was invisible. In private, it was everywhere. To the average German, the Gestapo was omnipotent, a force that knew all, saw all, and could strike at any moment. But in truth, it was far smaller than people imagined. In 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, the Gestapo numbered fewer than 16,000 officers, one agent for every 10,000 citizens. Their power came not from their presence, but from the fear they had created. A single knock on the door at night was enough to silence an entire street. And so the foundations of Nazi Germany were laid, not upon loyalty, but upon terror. The Gestapo had built a nation that no longer needed chains to remain obedient. By 1935, the Gestapo was no longer just a police force. It had become a system, cold, methodical, and absolute. Every arrest, every interrogation, every disappearance was part of a larger design. The goal was not merely to destroy opposition, but to erase the very idea of resistance. The organization was deceptively small, yet terrifyingly efficient. Its headquarters in Berlin, at Prinz-Albrecht-Strasse, was the beating heart of fear in the Third Reich. From this building, orders were sent out across Germany. Within its gray walls, thousands were interrogated, tortured, and condemned. The corridors smelled of cigarette smoke, sweat, and despair. The walls were soundproof. Under Heinrich Himmler and his ruthless deputy Reinhard Heydrich, the Gestapo became an arm of the Reich Security Main Office (RSHA), which united all Nazi intelligence and police agencies under one command. This was bureaucracy turned into a weapon. Everything had a form, a file, a stamp, and a death sentence hidden between the lines. The Gestapo operated under one guiding principle: protect the state by any means necessary. That meant there were no rules. The Constitution of the Weimar Republic, which once guaranteed rights and legal protections, was now meaningless. Warrants were unnecessary, trials optional, evidence irrelevant. A suspicion was enough. A letter could condemn a man. A rumor could end a life. People were arrested for telling jokes about Hitler, for failing to salute, for listening to foreign radio broadcasts, for being seen with a Jewish friend. Most of these cases began not with Gestapo surveillance, but with civilian denunciations. Entire neighborhoods became webs of fear. The interrogations were conducted with precision and cruelty. Torture was not an act of rage, it was a process. Prisoners were beaten, starved, and humiliated until they confessed, often to crimes that never existed. Some were sent directly to concentration camps, others simply vanished. Their families received a letter: "Your relative has been transferred for re-education." Few ever returned. But what made the Gestapo's terror unique was its facade of legality. Every act of brutality was justified by paperwork. Interrogations were documented, executions had signatures. It was evil disguised as order, a state that murdered through office memos. Himmler understood the psychology of fear. He knew that total control required not constant violence, but the threat of it, so the Gestapo learned to be selective. They struck publicly, efficiently, and without hesitation, enough to remind everyone that the eye of the Reich was always watching. The result was self-censorship on a national scale. Germany became a nation of whispers. People spoke only in safe rooms. They lowered their voices in trains and cafes. Jokes about politics were told in code. Children were warned not to repeat what they heard at home. By 1936, the Gestapo's reach extended beyond Germany's borders. Agents were stationed in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and later in occupied Poland. Their task was to identify Jews, communists, and anyone suspected of racial impurity or disloyalty. They built files on thousands, then millions. The Volksgemeinschaft, the so-called People's Community, was nothing more than a society held together by surveillance. Nazi propaganda painted it as unity and pride. In truth, it was obedience enforced through terror. The Gestapo ensured that every citizen's silence became complicity. Inside their reports, Gestapo officers described their work as maintaining peace. They called arrests preventive custody. They claimed to be protecting Germany from chaos. But the chaos they feared most was freedom itself. Even among the Gestapo's own ranks, fear was constant. Officers who hesitated or questioned orders were quickly replaced, sometimes arrested. Loyalty was demanded, not earned. And because everyone spied on everyone, no one was ever safe, not even the watchers themselves. By the late 1930s, the Gestapo had refined its methods to near perfection. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels controlled what people saw and heard. The Gestapo controlled what they dared to think. Together, they created a society where truth was irrelevant and fear was law. The people of Germany had not simply been conquered, they had been conditioned. And soon, that conditioning would be tested beyond imagination when the Gestapo followed the Wehrmacht into war, carrying its invisible terror into every land the Nazis touched. When the Second World War began in September 1939, the Gestapo was ready. It had spent 6 years perfecting the science of control, and now that machinery of fear was unleashed upon the rest of Europe. As German tanks rolled into Poland, Gestapo officers followed close behind, not to fight, but to cleanse. In every city the Wehrmacht conquered, the Gestapo arrived to build order through terror. They established field offices in captured buildings, commandeered police stations, and converted schools and town halls into interrogation centers. Their mission was clear: destroy the political, religious, and cultural life of occupied nations before resistance could take root. Poland was their first laboratory. Within weeks of invasion, thousands of Polish teachers, priests, and intellectuals were rounded up. The Gestapo called it the Intelligenzaktion, the extermination of the intelligentsia. It was not chaos, it was calculated murder. Lists had been prepared months in advance. Whole villages were erased because one man had spoken against German rule. The Gestapo's methods were simple and merciless. Arrests came at night, doors were broken down. Families dragged into the street, those taken away rarely returned. In Warsaw, Krakow, and Poznań, prisons overflowed within days. The Gestapo built their own, damp, airless cells where screams never reached the surface. Soon, the secret police became the architects of the Nazi occupation system. They worked hand in hand with the SS and the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that followed the front lines. The Gestapo provided intelligence, names, addresses, lists of undesirables. The SS provided bullets. Together they turned conquest into extermination. When France fell in 1940, the Gestapo established its European network in Paris. From the former headquarters of the French police, they coordinated arrests, interrogations, and deportations. They hunted resistance fighters, communists, Jews, and anyone accused of helping the Allies. The methods were identical everywhere: infiltration, betrayal, terror. They had a weapon more powerful than guns: informants. Across occupied Europe, fear became currency. To survive, people denounced one another, sometimes out of hatred, sometimes out of desperation. The Gestapo rewarded information with food, money, or simply mercy. In every town, every block, someone was listening. In France, the Gestapo became the unseen rulers of daily life. Their officers moved through the streets in civilian clothes, fluent in local languages, able to appear and vanish without trace. They organized raids on cafes, schools, churches. At night, trucks stopped outside apartment blocks, and the sound of boots on stairs meant only one thing. Interrogations were a ritual of cruelty. Prisoners were beaten, burned, electrocuted, or drowned in buckets of water until they named others. No confession was ever enough. One arrest led to 10 to 100. Torture rooms in Paris, Warsaw, and Prague became factories of despair. And yet, even in those basements, people resisted, tearing up lists, protecting names, refusing to break. The Gestapo called resistance fighters terrorists. To them, patriotism was a crime punishable by death. By 1941, as Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Gestapo's work reached new extremes. In the East, they became part of the machinery of genocide. Their task was to identify and eliminate Jews, communists, and partisans, enemies of the Reich. Entire ghettos were created under their supervision. Families were registered, marked, and deported on trains the Gestapo scheduled with bureaucratic precision. They took pride in their efficiency. Each transport was documented. Each prisoner counted, each execution reported. It was the same cold professionalism that had once governed police work, now repurposed for mass murder. In the occupied territories, the Gestapo also ran psychological operations. Propaganda leaflets, radio broadcasts, and forged letters were used to spread confusion among the population. Resistance groups were infiltrated and dismantled from within. Sometimes, captured agents were forced to send false messages to their comrades, leading them into traps. But the Gestapo's greatest weapon remained fear. Entire nations lived under it. People crossed the street to avoid eye contact, burned letters, and whispered in their own homes. To speak out was to die, to remain silent was to survive. Even among the Nazis, the Gestapo was feared. Wehrmacht officers and SS men knew that one wrong word could bring the knock at their own door. In Hitler's empire, loyalty was a prison with invisible walls. By 1943, as Germany's fortunes began to crumble, the Gestapo tightened its grip even further. They executed deserters, hunted escapees, and purged anyone suspected of defeatism. Their power no longer came from Hitler's victories, but from his paranoia. And yet, for all their brutality, the Gestapo could not stop what was coming. Every act of terror created new resistance, every murder inspired another rebellion. And as the war turned against Germany, the secret police found themselves trapped inside their own system, a machine that could not stop killing even when its masters were doomed. The Gestapo had built an empire of fear that stretched across Europe. Now that empire was beginning to collapse. By 1944, the war that Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years was beginning to crumble around him. Cities lay in ruins, armies were retreating, and the myth of Nazi invincibility was collapsing under Allied bombs. But even as defeat loomed, one force inside the Reich refused to yield: the Gestapo. If the German army fought for territory, the Gestapo fought for control. Their battlefield was no longer foreign soil. It was the German people themselves. As the Allies advanced, paranoia infected the Nazi hierarchy. Every setback, every rumor of dissent was treated as treason. The Gestapo turned its gaze inward, hunting not just Jews and foreigners, but Germans who doubted victory. Soldiers who deserted, citizens who whispered, priests who spoke of peace. All became enemies of the state. The prisons filled again, this time with the regime's own children. In 1944, after the failed assassination attempt on Hitler, the July 20th plot, the Gestapo unleashed one of the largest purges in its history. Over 7,000 people were arrested, many of them high-ranking officers, professors, and even members of the aristocracy. The conspirators were hanged on piano wires in Gestapo prisons, their deaths filmed for Hitler's personal viewing. The message was clear. No one, not even loyal Germans, was beyond suspicion. The Gestapo had always been brutal, but now it became desperate. Files grew thinner, evidence weaker, confessions more violent. Torture replaced investigation, hysteria replaced logic. As the Reich disintegrated, the Gestapo's control became less about law and more about revenge. In Berlin, headquarters at Prinz-Albrecht-Strasse became a fortress of madness. Cells overflowed with prisoners, the air reeked of blood and fear. Guards who once followed orders mechanically now acted out of panic. Files were burned by the thousands, names erased in the smoke. Every officer knew what awaited them if the Allies arrived: trials, prison, or the gallows. Across occupied Europe, the Gestapo's branches followed the same pattern. In Paris, Warsaw, Prague, and Amsterdam, the secret police destroyed evidence, executed witnesses, and fled west with whatever documents they could carry. Trucks filled with archives drove through the night toward Germany, many disappearing forever. But even as the system collapsed, its cruelty deepened. In the last months of the war, the Gestapo executed thousands of prisoners, Jews, partisans, civilians, even German soldiers accused of cowardice. Every retreating step was marked with a trail of corpses meant to delay the inevitable. The propaganda still called it defense of the homeland. In reality, it was a massacre of their own people. Meanwhile, within Germany's cities, fear had reached its final evolution. There were no more illusions, no more belief in victory, only terror of saying the wrong thing. The people hid from bombs above and from the Gestapo below. Mothers told their children, if they knock, you didn't hear it. The country had become a prison guarded by itself. In early 1945, as the Red Army approached from the east, Gestapo men abandoned their posts or tried to disguise themselves as regular soldiers. Some burned their uniforms, others fled under false names. But many stayed, clinging to duty, killing until the very last hour. In the concentration camps, the Gestapo oversaw the final evacuations. These were not rescues, they were death marches. Tens of thousands of emaciated prisoners were forced to walk for miles through the winter, guarded by men who knew the war was lost. Those who fell behind were shot on the roadside. Back in Berlin, chaos reigned. The once feared secret police were now both hunters and hunted. Soviet artillery shook the city. The sky turned red again, as it had in the early days of the Blitz, yet even as the Führer hid in his bunker, the Gestapo still carried out executions. They killed resistance members, deserters, and anyone accused of defeatism, even as Russian troops entered the suburbs. The very machine that had built the Nazi Empire was now devouring itself. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler shot himself. Within days, the Gestapo's power evaporated. Officers fled, surrendered, or committed suicide. Allied soldiers entered their offices and found mountains of files, torture chambers, and corpses. The myth of the all-knowing Gestapo collapsed into dust and paper. And yet, even in its death, it left behind something more enduring than buildings or uniforms. It left behind memory. In every country it touched, people remembered the knock on the door, the sound of boots in the night, the fear of speaking freely. That fear would outlive the Reich itself. Because the Gestapo had proven something terrible, that a nation can be conquered not just by armies, but by its own obedience. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Allies entered the heart of the Reich and found the evidence of what fear had built. The Gestapo's offices stood half-burned, their basements filled with shredded papers, broken chains, and corpses left behind in haste. The walls that had absorbed screams for 12 years now stood mute under the dust of defeat. The empire of silence had ended, but its shadow was only beginning to speak. At first, the world could not comprehend the scale. The Gestapo had been a ghost throughout the war. Unseen, unnamed, omnipresent. Its agents rarely wore uniforms, and many had fled before capture. But the files that survived told the story that the dead could not. Pages of names, addresses, confessions, and signatures, millions of them. The bureaucracy of terror preserved in ink. The Allied investigators uncovered the machine in full. They found how each German district had its own Gestapo branch, how thousands of ordinary citizens had volunteered as informants, and how the organization had coordinated directly with the SS and concentration camp commandants. The Gestapo was not a rogue force, it was the state itself, stripped of its mask. At the Nuremberg trials, the Gestapo was declared a criminal organization. Its leaders, Heinrich Müller, Reinhard Heydrich already dead, and Himmler were accused of orchestrating crimes against humanity. But the truth was more complicated. The Gestapo was not just a handful of men. It was a system powered by fear and sustained by obedience. It lived in the reports, the signatures, and the silences of millions. Most of its officers escaped justice. Many blended back into German society, changing names, finding new work in police and intelligence services. West Germany, rebuilding itself under Allied supervision, needed stability, and for that, it often turned a blind eye. The same men who had once hunted citizens for jokes about Hitler now investigated petty thefts under a new flag. For the survivors, the war never truly ended. The memories remained, of doors kicked in at midnight, of interrogations in windowless rooms, of loved ones who vanished without trace. For years after the war, Germans spoke of the Gestapo in whispers as if the walls still had ears. The organization was gone, but the habit of fear remained. Historians studying post-war Germany called it the internal Gestapo. The people no longer needed secret police. They had learned to police themselves. The line between authority and conscience had blurred so deeply that even peace could not erase it. In the East, under Soviet occupation, the irony was cruel. The same methods that the Gestapo had perfected, surveillance, denunciation, terror, were now used by Stalin's secret police. The names changed, but the logic remained: control through fear, loyalty through silence. Humanity had not learned, it had adapted. As decades passed, the Gestapo became less an institution and more a symbol. In history books, it stood for the ultimate corruption of law, when justice becomes a weapon and citizens become spies against themselves. In films and documentaries, the image of the black car arriving in the night became shorthand for tyranny itself. But behind those images are the small, human truths: the clerk who stamped deportation papers to keep his job, the teacher who reported a student for mocking Hitler, the neighbor who stayed silent as another was taken away. The Gestapo did not invent evil. It merely organized it. And perhaps that is the most terrifying lesson: that totalitarianism does not need monsters, only ordinary people who prefer safety to conscience. When survivors testified at Nuremberg, their words carried the weight of the world's shame. "We were afraid," one said, "afraid to speak, afraid to think, afraid to feel." And when fear rules everything, evil becomes easy. The Gestapo had fallen, but its echo still lived in every dictatorship that used fear as law, in every regime that silenced truth for obedience. From the Soviet gulags to the secret prisons of later wars, its shadow stretched across the century. Today, the building at Prinz-Albrecht-Strasse is gone. In its place stands the Topography of Terror Museum, a memorial built from the ruins of the Gestapo and SS headquarters. Visitors walk through photographs and testimonies, reading the words of both victims and perpetrators. The air there is quiet, the same silence the Gestapo once demanded, now turned into remembrance. It is said that the Gestapo controlled Germany by making people believe they were always being watched. The tragedy is that they were right, because even after the watchers were gone, the fear remained in the hearts they had conquered. And so the lesson of the Gestapo endures, not as a story of Germany alone, but as a warning to every society that mistakes obedience for peace. A nation can rebuild its cities, it can bury its dead. But once fear becomes law, freedom never truly returns.